I did not wake up one morning expecting everything to change. There was no thunder, no loud announcement, no dramatic sign in the sky. There was only a quiet knowing deep inside my spirit that something had to shift. I was tired of living on the surface of life, tired of carrying weight I could not explain, tired of knowing God was near yet feeling him far. So I made a simple decision. For 7 days I would live differently, not louder, not busier, but deeper. The first habit was silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of stillness. I learned that God does not compete with noise. When I became quiet, I began to hear what had always been speaking. In those moments of stillness, something gentle yet powerful settled over my heart. Peace came without explanation. Answers came without effort. I realized how often I had mistaken activity for devotion, movement for faith. The second habit was surrender. Each morning, before my thoughts could run ahead of me, I offered my will back to God. Not with grand words, but with honesty. I laid down my plans, my fears, my expectations, and something remarkable happened. The burden I had been carrying lifted. I discovered that surrender is not weakness, it is freedom. When I stopped trying to control outcomes, I felt carried instead. The third habit was gratitude. Not gratitude for perfect circumstances, but gratitude in the middle of imperfect ones. I thanked God for what was, not just what I hoped would be. And gratitude changed my vision. What once felt empty became full. What once felt delayed became purposeful. Thanksgiving opened my eyes to blessings I had overlooked, because I was too focused on what was missing. The fourth habit was obedience in small things. Not waiting for a great calling, but responding faithfully in quiet moments. A kind word spoken, a thought corrected, a nudge followed. I learned that God often moves through simple obedience. There was no applause, no recognition, but there was a deep inner confirmation that I was walking in alignment. And alignment brings peace no applause ever could. The fifth habit was trust. Trusting God when I could not trace him. Trusting his timing when mine felt urgent. Trusting his heart when my understanding fell short. Trust softened my soul. Anxiety lost its grip. Fear no longer dictated my decisions. I rested in the assurance that I was not alone, not forgotten, not misplaced. After 7 days, my life looked the same on the outside, but everything had changed on the inside. My thoughts were quieter. My heart was lighter. My spirit was awake. I realized transformation does not always announce itself. Sometimes it happens gently, faithfully, one surrendered day at a time. God had not moved closer. He had always been near. I had simply made room. I did not realize how much noise had filled my life until I tried to remove it. The noise was not only around me, but within me. Thoughts racing ahead of peace, worries speaking louder than faith, opinions crowding out conviction. I had learned how to pray with words, but I had forgotten how to listen with my heart. When I chose stillness, it felt unfamiliar at first, almost uncomfortable, as though I had stepped into a quiet room after living beside a busy road. Yet in that stillness, something deeper began to awaken. Stillness is not emptiness, it is awareness. When I slowed my breathing and quieted my thoughts, I became conscious of a presence that had never left me. God was not silent, I had been distracted. In the absence of constant stimulation, I felt a gentle assurance rise within my spirit, steady and unforced. It was not loud, yet it carried authority. The more I stayed still, the more I sensed clarity replacing confusion, calm replacing strain. At first my mind resisted. It wanted answers, explanations, immediate direction. But stillness does not rush revelation. It creates space for it. I learned that God speaks most clearly when I am no longer demanding to be heard. As I remained quiet, impressions formed that were not emotional but deeply settled. They did not argue with fear, they dissolved it. The voice of God did not compete with noise, it waited for surrender. In moments of stillness, I noticed how much of my spiritual life had been driven by effort. I had mistaken movement for progress. Yet God was drawing me into rest, not inactivity, but trust. In stillness, I stopped striving to prove faith and began to experience it. My heart softened, my thoughts slowed. The need to control faded into a willingness to be led. There were moments when no words came at all, and yet those were the most powerful moments. Silence became sacred. I realized that communion with God does not always involve speech. Sometimes it is simply remaining, allowing His presence to settle over the soul like a quiet assurance that everything is held. In that space, burdens I had carried unconsciously began to lift, not because I named them, but because I was no longer gripping them. Stillness changed how I approached life beyond prayer. I became less reactive, more discerning. Decisions were no longer driven by urgency but by peace. I recognized that when God speaks, He does not agitate the heart, He steadies it. And that steadiness became a guide I learned to trust. Surrender did not come naturally to me because I had spent so much of my life believing that strength meant control. I thought faith was proven by how firmly I held everything together, how carefully I managed outcomes, how prepared I stayed for every possible turn. Yet beneath that effort was exhaustion, a quiet fear of what might happen if I let go. When I chose surrender as a daily habit, it felt like stepping into unknown territory, uncertain and deeply humbling. Each morning, before the day could shape my thoughts, I offered my will to God, not with rehearsed language, but with honesty. I acknowledged my limits, my uncertainties, my need for guidance. Surrender was not a single moment but a continual posture, returning again and again to a place of yielding. At first my mind resisted, questioning whether releasing control would leave me vulnerable or directionless. What I discovered was the opposite. In surrender, clarity emerged. When I stopped insisting on my own way, I became aware of a peace that did not depend on circumstances aligning perfectly. There was a quiet confidence that replaced anxiety, not because every question was answered, but because I was no longer carrying the weight of answering them alone. Surrender did not remove responsibility, it redefined it. Letting go exposed how tightly fear had shaped my decisions. Fear of failure, fear of delay, fear of disappointment. As I surrendered those fears, I noticed how gently God redirected my steps. Doors I had forced closed naturally. Paths I had overlooked became visible. There was no pressure, no urgency, only a steady sense of being guided rather than driven. Surrender also required trust in timing. I learned that God's work is not hurried and alignment cannot be rushed. When I released my timelines, I felt relief rather than loss. Waiting became purposeful instead of frustrating. The need to see immediate results gave way to confidence in unseen progress. Growth was happening beneath the surface. Even when nothing outward appeared to change, there were moments when surrender felt costly, when obedience required laying down preferences and expectations. Yet in those moments, I sensed an exchange taking place. What I released was replaced with something lighter, something truer. Control gave way to peace. Striving gave way to rest. The more I surrendered, the more I recognized that I had never been meant to carry everything on my own. Surrender reshaped my understanding of faith. It was no longer about effort or endurance, but about alignment and trust. In yielding my will, I found direction. In releasing control, I found freedom. Gratitude began as a discipline, not a feeling. I did not always feel thankful, especially when circumstances seemed ordinary, delayed, or disappointing. Yet I chose to practice gratitude daily, not as a response to what was going right, but as an act of faith. At first it felt simple, almost insignificant, but as I continued, I realized how deeply gratitude reshapes the inner life. When I intentionally gave thanks, my attention shifted. I stopped measuring my days by what was missing and began noticing what had been present all along. Small moments carried weight again. Breath, light, provision, strength to endure another day. Gratitude did not change my circumstances immediately, but it changed my awareness of them. What once felt empty now felt filled with quiet purpose. I discovered that gratitude has a way of softening the heart. Complaints lost their hold, not because problems disappeared, but because my spirit was no longer anchored to dissatisfaction. Thanksgiving created space for peace. Where anxiety had once crowded my thoughts, calm began to take its place. I understood that gratitude is not denial of difficulty, it is recognition of God within it. As gratitude deepened, I noticed how it affected my relationship with God. Prayer felt less like asking and more like communion. Instead of approaching Him only with needs, I approached Him with acknowledgement. Gratitude drew me into awareness of His nearness. The act of thanking Him opened my heart to trust His character, even when outcomes remained uncertain. Gratitude also corrected my perspective on timing. I had often rushed ahead, impatient for results, assuming delay meant denial. Through thanksgiving, I learned to honor the present moment without demanding the future. Waiting became less heavy. I recognized that gratitude keeps the soul anchored in now, where God meets us, rather than in imagined outcomes that fuel restlessness. There were moments when gratitude required intention, especially on difficult days. Yet those were the days when it mattered most. Giving thanks in the midst of uncertainty strengthened my faith. It reminded me that God's goodness is not dependent on visible success. Gratitude trained my spirit to see beyond appearances and rest in truth rather than emotion. Over time, gratitude became less of an effort and more of a posture. My inner language shifted. Instead of asking why, I began asking what can be learned here. Instead of focusing on lack, I recognized provision in unexpected forms. Gratitude refined my vision, allowing me to perceive grace woven into everyday life. Through this practice, I understood that gratitude is transformative, not because it alters reality, but because it aligns the heart with divine perspective. Thanksgiving does not ignore pain. It places it within a greater awareness of purpose and presence. Obedience in small things seemed almost insignificant at first. I was conditioned to look for grand moments, dramatic instructions, and unmistakable signs. I believed that meaningful obedience would always feel important, noticeable, and purposeful. Yet what I discovered was that Saint spiritual alignment begins quietly, in moments that appear ordinary and easily overlooked. Choosing obedience in small things required attentiveness rather than ambition. Each day presented subtle opportunities to respond rightly. A thought that needed correcting, a word that needed restraint, a kindness that required inconvenience. None of these moments drew attention, yet each carried weight. I learned that obedience is not measured by visibility, but by faithfulness. When I responded to these gentle promptings, something within me settled into harmony. At times, obedience challenged my comfort. It asked me to act when it would have been easier to remain silent, to pause when I wanted to rush, to yield when I felt justified in holding my ground. These moments revealed how deeply habit and impulse can guide behavior. Obedience interrupted those patterns, creating space for intention and humility. As I practiced obedience in small matters, my sensitivity increased. I became more aware of inner promptings, less dismissive of quiet direction. What once felt like coincidence began to feel purposeful. There was a growing sense that my daily choices were shaping something beyond immediate results. Obedience was training my heart to recognize alignment. I noticed that peace often followed obedience, even when the outcome was uncertain. There was no guarantee of understanding, no immediate affirmation, but there was an inner confirmation that I was walking rightly. This peace did not depend on success or recognition. It flowed from knowing I had responded faithfully. Regardless of whether the result was seen or unseen, small obedience also revealed areas of resistance within me. Pride, impatience, and self-reliance surfaced when obedience required yielding my preference. These moments became invitations to growth. Each choice to obey softened my heart, gradually loosening the grip of ego and fear. I realized that obedience is not about restriction, but about transformation. Over time, obedience in small things reshaped how I approach larger decisions. Trust developed naturally, built upon countless faithful responses in quiet moments. I no longer felt the need to force clarity or rush direction. I understood that consistent obedience creates readiness, preparing the heart to respond when greater responsibility is given. Through this practice, I learned that obedience does not always lead to immediate reward, but it always leads to alignment. Faithfulness in the unseen forms the foundation for confidence in the visible. The smallest acts, when offered sincerely, become pathways through which God shapes character and purpose. Trusting God beyond understanding required me to confront how deeply I relied on certainty. I had become accustomed to clarity, timelines, and explanations as evidence that things were unfolding correctly. When those were absent, unease followed. Choosing trust as a daily habit meant releasing the demand to know how everything would work out and learning to rest in who was guiding the process. At first, trust felt passive, almost irresponsible. My mind resisted the idea of moving forward without full assurance. Yet I discovered that trust is not the absence of thought, but the refusal to let fear dictate direction. When I leaned into trust, I sensed a quiet strength replacing anxiety. The pressure to anticipate every outcome loosened its grip. There were moments when circumstances offered no visible reassurance. Progress seemed slow, answers delayed, and clarity distant. In those moments, trust became an active decision rather than an emotion. I chose to believe in God's faithfulness even when evidence felt insufficient. This choice did not eliminate uncertainty, but it anchored my spirit within it. Trust also reshaped my relationship with timing. I learned that urgency often comes from fear rather than necessity. When I surrendered my timelines, patience grew. Waiting no longer felt like stagnation, but like preparation. I began to understand that what is delayed is not always denied, and what unfolds slowly often forms deeply. As trust deepened, I noticed how it affected my reactions. Situations that once triggered anxiety now invited reflection. Instead of immediately seeking control, I paused. That pause created space for discernment. I learned that trust allows room for wisdom to surface, guiding responses rather than reactions. Trusting God beyond understanding also required humility. I had to acknowledge that my perspective was limited. Letting go of the need to interpret every detail freed me from constant evaluation. I realized that faith does not demand comprehension before obedience. Trust comes first, understanding follows in its time. Over time, trust softened my inner world. Fear lost its authority. I became less defensive, more open. I no longer felt threatened by uncertainty. Instead, I recognized it as an invitation to rely more fully on divine guidance. Trust taught me that peace is not found in knowing what comes next, but in knowing who walks with me through it. Through this practice, I discovered that trust does not remove challenges, but it changes how they are carried. When understanding fails, trust sustains. When clarity fades, trust steadies. In leaning fully into God, I found a rest that reasoning alone could never provide. Making room for God required an honest look at how full my inner life had become. My days were crowded with thoughts, plans, expectations, and constant movement. Even moments meant for prayer were often rushed, filled with words but lacking openness. Choosing to make room was not about adding another activity to my routine, but about creating space within my heart where God could dwell freely. I began by recognizing the subtle ways I resisted stillness. Discomfort surfaced when there was nothing to do, nothing to solve, nothing to manage. That discomfort revealed how accustomed I had become to control and distraction. As I allowed silence and openness, I sensed how gently God filled the space I had finally offered. His presence did not overwhelm, it settled. Making room meant releasing internal clutter. Old disappointments, unspoken fears, and lingering expectations had quietly taken residence within me. I learned that God does not force entry into crowded places. As I acknowledged and released these inner burdens, there was a lightness that followed. The act of making room became an act of trust, allowing God access to places I had guarded carefully. This openness reshaped my spiritual posture. Prayer shifted from performance to presence. I no longer felt compelled to impress or explain. I remained available, receptive, aware. In that availability, I sensed guidance arising naturally, not through effort, but through alignment. God spoke through peace, through clarity, through a steady assurance that required no elaboration. As I made room, my awareness extended beyond spiritual moments into daily life. I noticed how God moved through ordinary interactions, gentle promptings, quiet confirmations. Making room was not confined to isolated moments of devotion. It became a way of living attentively. The sacred began to appear in places I had once considered ordinary. There were moments when making room felt vulnerable. Letting go of internal noise exposed uncertainty. Yet in that vulnerability, I experienced safety rather than fear. God's presence became a refuge, not an intrusion. The more space I offered, the more I sensed His nearness, shaping my responses, calming my thoughts, guiding my steps. Over time, making room transformed my inner landscape. Peace replaced restlessness. Awareness replaced distraction. I became less driven by impulse and more anchored in presence. The external world remained busy, but my inner world grew spacious and steady. In creating room for God, I discovered that transformation does not require force, only availability.